I've said it before and I'm sure I'll end up saying it again, but Marvel Select releases are very much like buses. You have nothing for ages and then suddenly quite a few all at once. So today, for the third week in a row, I'll be taking a look at another new Marvel Select release, which this time of course is the Human Torch. It's amazing to think that the Human Torch is only the second character from the Fantastic Four lineup to actually be released in this line. Now that is something that Diamond Select Toys are obviously eager to rectify, because we are getting a Mr. Fantastic and I think an Invisible Woman by the end of 2023. So I'm super excited to finally have the option to complete my Fantastic Four lineup, because up until now we've only had one slightly disappointing release in The Thing. So let's get straight into it by looking at the packaging. Of course, we know what to expect from Marvel Select. These are giant, oversized packaging, whether the figure warrants it or not. In this case, we have a much smaller figure, but he does come with quite a sizable base, actually, so I think he takes up the packaging quite nicely. But the overall impression is very nice. This is quite displayable. It's not the brightest packaging. You think that some of that collage in the background there would actually be a little bit brighter to reflect the character, but I suppose they really wanted that Human Torch to really stand out in the text there. So overall, this is still very presentable. This looks quite nice. Now, if we look at the side panel, this is a little bit disappointing for me. I would much rather they had opted to go for some comic book art as they usually do and be more consistent with the line as a whole. Here, of course, they've opted for a less than impressive image of the actual figure itself, and I don't think they've actually done it justice, to be honest. Now, if we look at the back of the packaging, again, what we get here is just that same image and a little bit of text talking about the character. This isn't really super displayable. It's not the most impressive, and I would much rather we'd seen some actual artwork here, which would have been much more interesting. Now, to be completely honest, I was actually in two minds whether to pick this figure up. A lot of the initial photography that I saw of this figure didn't look very exciting, to be honest, and it looked a little bit limiting, and that was such a misdirection, I've got to say. I don't think it was the best photo shoot they've ever produced for one of the figures in this line, because I have to say this figure has really surprised me, and it's actually very impressive on multiple levels. So first of all, let's take a look at this head sculpt. I think they've done a tremendous job with all the flame effects on this body. Of course, they're mostly sculpted in, some have been stuck on afterwards, but they're different colours, and the sculpting itself is very, very nicely done. So I think they've done a really good job with this. This definitely looks recognisable as Johnny Storm, Human Torch, but of course there is also an option for the classic Human Torch as well, and we'll come to that a little bit later. Now, if we look at the torso, there's actually a surprising amount of detail in here. We can see the various lines, the different muscle groups. Of course, they haven't really relied on paint apps because, of course, it is a translucent plastic, because he will glow up, and we'll see what that looks like in a moment or two. But as you can see, this is very nicely sculpted. There's actually a lot of hidden depth and detail in here. Of course, we have that 4 icon logo in the center of his chest. That's a different color. That's a brighter yellow, which makes it stand out and is significant. Again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Meanwhile, his legs, feet, and of course the rest of his torso is a much slighter frame than we're used to seeing in this line. That's entirely appropriate for Johnny Storm. Of course, he should be a regular human being. He's not supposed to be oversized anyway, so this works very nice in terms of scaling. And as I mentioned, he is translucent, so if we stick a light behind him, we can see that light comes through, and wow, this is actually really good and surprisingly effective. Place it at the back, the center of his back there, and it really looks like he's genuinely on fire, because we can see a number of different colors here, red and yellow, and it actually works really well. He also fares really quite well in the articulation department as well. He has a ball joint in the head, which means of course he can spin his head all the way around, he can look up and down, and he can wobble it from side to side as well. So there's actually a pretty big range of motion here, which is really appreciated and I think works very well for this character. Now, he's got ball joints in his shoulders, so his arms will go up a fair distance. There's a little bit of hindrance there from some of the plastic flame at the top, but it's a pretty good gap that we have. There's a pin swivel at his elbow, so that lower arm will rotate all the way around, and of course hinge to 90 degrees. And then there's another pin swivel at the wrist, so again, it will rotate all the way around and it will hinge forwards and backwards as well. So pretty good range of motion here. The one disappointment I found was in this central torso joint. It will allow him to move sort of from side to side, and he'll kind of moves forward and backwards, but there's not a great range of motion here, which is disappointing. Of course, he does have hinge at the hips. The legs will kick out to the side, they'll kick forwards and backwards a little bit. There's another pin swivel at the lower leg, so that will move from side to side, and finally there is a hinge, just a hinge, at the ankle. As I said, my expectations for this figure were actually quite low, so I was really pleasantly surprised by some of the clever accessories that we get here. We get an alternate head, a classic Human Torch from the 40s head, which is very unexpected and very cool. So this figure can essentially serve as two different characters, which is very fun. He has an alternate flame effect right hand with 5 individual fireballs coming out the fingers, which is great. He has an extra pair of closed fists and an alternate left hand, which actually has a fireball in his hand ready to throw, which is fantastic. There's an extra flame effect which goes into his chest, and we'll look at that in a moment, and then he has this flame base as well. Now, for any long-term Marvel Legends collectors out there, this will look very familiar if we go all the way back to Series 2 of the Marvel Legends line. When Toy Biz produced their own version of the Human Torch, he came with a stand very similar to this. It's not exactly the same, but very close, and it's certainly fair to say that they maybe took some inspiration for that, but I have to say, this works surprisingly well. It connects to Johnny through a very simple ball and socket. As you can see, there is a socket there in his back, and you just simply snap him into place. And this holds him securely very well. The only downside to this stand is that it is vertical, and because of the nature of the torso of the actual figure itself, it means you can't really get too many different dynamic poses when he's on this stand. Unfortunately, you can't really get him to be flying horizontal. He's always going to be in a vertical position. But thanks to some of these other fantastic extras, these accessories he comes with, the various flame effects in his hands, I actually can get some really dynamic poses out of this stand, and it looks really fantastic. He looks very, very striking on display, and I have to say, he's really won me over. Now, I did want to mention that you can actually remove this Fantastic Four logo. You can swap that out for a bit of flame, and of course, if you utilize the other head that we have, you will have your own classic Human Torch. So I love that we have two options for this particular figure. I think that's really fantastic, makes him really versatile, and of course you do have the option to pick up two and have two different Human Torches in your collection, which is really cool stuff. Now, I did want to compare the Human Torch to the Marvel Select Thing. Unfortunately, mine is in mothballs at the moment, packed away, so I wasn't able to get them out and put them side by side, and I desperately want to do a size comparison. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that this time. But just to give you an impression, of course, here he is next to the Thing. Now, these aren't quite to scale. The Thing is oversized, he's a bit taller than the Human Torch, but you get a sense of what they look like together. Now, I've never been a huge fan of this release of the Thing. I'm kind of hoping that maybe we'll get a reissue, something a little bit tweaked, a little bit different, a bit more distinct, because this, although it's not a bad figure by any stretch of the imagination, it's a little bit disappointing and a bit clunky to some of the other fantastic figures we're getting in this line. So then, final thoughts from me. Well, as I said, as someone who really wasn't expecting to like this figure, he really has won me over. I love this figure to bits. I'm really very, very pleasantly surprised by what has been released here. So for me, I'm going to give this figure actually 4 stars. Now, I would be tempted to give it 5 stars, but there's just something just holding it back, and that for me is the articulation in that torso there. That's really disappointing, and also I know a lot of people are going to be upset by the hinge in the hips there. That looks a little bit unsightly, but other than that, I love this figure, and I really wasn't expecting to. I think they haven't done a particularly great job of marketing it when it comes to the promotional images they put out there, because it does not marry up with what this figure is actually like in hand. I think this is a wonderful figure. It looks fantastic, it lights up brilliantly, and the accessories are really, really fun and cool, and they've gone that extra mile there by giving you the classic Human Torch options as well, which I think will please a lot of fans as well. So I think this is a fantastic figure. I think it's, pardon the pun, and I do think this bodes very, very well for the other Fantastic Four characters who are coming later this year, and I can't wait to actually build out the rest of this set. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.